Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panelists being here today, and the topic that we're discussing is obviously of great significance to each of us in this room and to people around our country and around the world. It is my view that 50 years from now, as people look back to our generation and ask what our legacy might have been, that upon which they will be most critical was our failure to act to prevent the warming of the planet and the climate change associated with that warming, and that the political winds that prevented us from acting will be seen as an extraordinary lapse in America's judgment, and that this is a time for us to come together and to find solutions that will actually help protect our planet for future generations. I note, of course, that the challenge we're dealing with is global. Not simply regional. It's not simply, obviously, an Asian issue, even though that's the topic for today, climate change as it relates to much of Asia, but also climate change here in the United States is of significance and around the world. I will also note, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, that my own perspective is that the only effective way we will have in dealing with climate change is through the advance in technology, technology which will be adopted not just here, but around the world, and adopted because it is effective in reducing emissions and also lower cost than some of the carbon-based alternatives. Because I think it's unlikely that poor nations in particular that are becoming developed will adopt technologies that are far more expensive, even if they reduce CO2. They will move to those things which are less expensive. So it's incumbent upon nations that have the resources we have to invest in technology, as fortunately our colleagues have recently voted to do, invest in technology which will help not only us reduce our emissions, but also help others in the rest of the world. I know that sometimes we're tempted to politically get behind initiatives that sound good, doing things here that people here feel like, boy, we're doing green things here, isn't that wonderful? But the reality is that those things won't make a hill of beans worth of a difference to reducing global emissions. They'll cost us a lot of money, sometimes cost us jobs, maybe not, maybe they'll actually create jobs in some cases, but they won't actually reduce emissions. What will reduce emissions is adopting technologies and developing technologies which will be used around the world. I fully concur with the view that America is responsible for a huge slug of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere, as the chairman indicated, beginning in the 19th century. This, of course, was at a time we didn't know we were doing anything wrong. But now we understand the consequence of this CO2 going into the environment, and not acting would be extraordinarily shameful. I would note that in the future, the growth in emissions of CO2 and other warming emissions is going to be driven not by the United States, because of course over the last decade our emissions have been coming down, as have those of the EU, but instead the developing nations, which understandably are getting washing machines and more automobiles, more electricity in the home, air conditioning, and as a result, China and Brazil and Indonesia, India are expected to dramatically increase their emissions of greenhouse gases. And so it's incumbent on us to take a close look at those places in particular and to see how we can help and encourage them to take action that does not add to the extraordinary burden that's in our environment. I'm concerned that China is hiding their CO2 plans by, if you will, exporting the production of facilities through Belt and Road, and putting infrastructure in place in other countries that'll be using or emitting vast amounts of greenhouse gases. And they'll say, see, we're not doing it, it's just being done in that other country, which, by the way, we happen to put that coal power plant there. So understanding China's role and how we can work together is important. At the same time, I'd note, and I know that the Chairman and I agree on this, it's critical as we deal with China that, yes, we want them and other nations to reduce their emissions and their plans going forward, but at the same time, we will not forget or look beyond, look away rather, from the predations of their economic activities, their military activities, in the South China Sea and elsewhere, and of course their extraordinary human rights abuses. With that, Mr. Chairman, I turn back to you and our panel. Thank you, Ms. Dalton. I think it's obvious to you that people are coming and going. That's not a sign of disrespect or lack of courtesy. It's the reality that we have votes going on, and so we have to pull out one by one to make sure that we're able to vote. Let me begin with a couple of questions. First to you, Mr. Braungun, and that is President Xi, during President Biden's April meeting on climate, reiterated the country's intent to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. How committed do you think President Xi is to those targets, and what actions are Chinese leaders taking to actually achieve them? How much of this is actually being just pushed off to a much later time when all these folks like me will be gone? And what's being done now, and how much is being avoided, or China reaching these goals by simply offloading their carbon demands onto other countries in the Belt and Road Initiative?
Thank you for your question, Senator. Yeah, that's certainly something that we are definitely tracking with great interest at the State Department. It's the fact that China represents almost 30% of global emissions, in addition to its carbon-intensive investments. We think that it's important to put expectations on the PRC in particular, that they back up what they say, what they promise, what they pledge with concrete actions. And that's not just for the PRC, but for any country that takes in the near term, they pledge and they meet the long-term goals that they set. We are, at the end of the day, we are going to be looking at what Beijing does and not what it says it will do or won't do. Certainly, President Xi has made many commitments to address the climate challenge on behalf of the PRC that we have yet to see materialize, and those are certainly topics of discussion at senior levels in our engagement with the PRC.
And from your perspective, is China continue to build coal power plants at home and or abroad?
Well, yeah, we certainly are seeing that, and I think that given China's reluctance to follow through on many of its pledges, I think the key here is to hold them accountable and to set very specific expectations to follow through on what they pledged, and calling out actions that are contrary to what they've pledged.
Yeah, I simply can't imagine having an objective that they've set, that President Xi set for 2030 and again for 2060, and at the same time building new coal power plants. I mean, there are alternatives, natural gas alternatives. Obviously, nuclear is not one that they're going to seize upon, but building new coal plants, particularly ones that not only add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, but also add other pollutants without the kind of scrubbing that we're used to here, it seems to be incompatible with the objectives that they're setting, and it does seem that what they're saying is designed to create a political win for them, but in reality, they don't seem to have much intent to actually make the kind of changes that would result in a reduction in CO2 growth or CO2 emissions.
I think that's right, and I think the responsibility is on us to ensure that as the PRC has pledged, that they follow through on their commitments, as I've said, and that they don't get a pass, which I think they've certainly expected. And they are certainly building the narrative that they are leaders in climate change and reduction of greenhouse gases. And I think the proof is in the pudding, as you pointed out, the actions that they've taken are contrary to what they've pledged.
Thank you. Mr. Pershing, Secretary Kerry has called for climate change to be treated as a compartmentalized issue in the U.S.-China relations. And yet, I think it's clear to us that in some respects they can't be compartmentalized, in part because of China's human rights abuses in the production of solar panels, fuel cell batteries, and even the procurement of raw earths. And so I'm wondering, can they be separated and treated as separate areas, or are they inextricably linked in a way that we can't ignore?
Thank you very much, Senator. Just a quick comment on your previous question before I answer that one. It does seem that there is some history where China has, in fact, met its commitments. And so I don't want the committee to be thinking that it's only bad. I agree with you, there's no way they get there if they keep building coal. No way. There's no way they get there if they keep investing in overseas coal. But historically, they've done more than they've said they would do, and they're on a trajectory that would suggest they could still meet this trajectory, this commitment. They exceeded their intensity targets, they exceeded their renewable targets, and it looks like they're not actually using the coal they're building. It's kind of an expensive program if you're not ever going to use it, but they're not using it, and so it doesn't lead to very many emissions. So there's a good question you're raising, but I think there's more nuance that is worth exploring. With regard to the human rights issues, we completely agree with you. It is an appalling state of affairs. And the objective that we've got is absolutely centered on how we address that. These are not necessarily things that have to be brought together, though. They're things we can distinguish and we can separate out. We want them to do their climate work, and we also want them to stop with human rights violations and abuses. And we want them to stop with the other things they've been doing on other interference globally. So I think as we see it, those two things can be pulled apart, and we can have a policy in which China moves aggressively and appropriately on climate, but also doesn't have these violations.
How do you do that with regards to batteries, for instance, and solar panels, where we're buying these things like crazy? We're planning an automotive market which will be overwhelmingly powered by electric vehicles, and yet these are being produced in places with minority, if you will, slave labor. I'll say internment camp labor. How can you compartmentalize those two things when they're so linked?
So I think there are two parts to that. The first one is that I think we can put in place standards that assure that the places from which we are purchasing those commodities and those goods do not have that labor. It's going to require some work on our side. The second is to extend the supply chain so it is not reliant on a single player like Xinjiang province or others who have those constraints. Those could be American jobs. Those could be jobs in our allies' countries. That could be a supply chain that we build out. So I think there's an opportunity for us to seize, as well as assuring that the chain itself is cleaned up so that we can actually get to the place we want to be.
Thank you, Mr. Pershing. Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Goodman. Appreciate your perspective. Thank you to the panelists today. I've explained before, and you probably heard it already, that we have voting going on the floor of the Senate. So members of this committee keep disappearing for long periods of time. It's getting over to the Capitol, getting our votes recorded, and then getting back. So this is no display of disrespect or lack of interest. It's instead just the reality of votes that we had not anticipated coming at this particular time. Mr. Powell, good to see you again. Appreciate your being here. I'm interested in your perspective on how we're going to deal with a real threat, which is the rising temperatures on the planet, the climate change we're seeing, the obvious consequence of that, which is already being borne out in some ways. And yet at the same time, we have the nations that are emitting more and more and that are growing their emissions are nations that are not as wealthy as us, whether it's Indonesia or the Philippines or India. China obviously has an economy almost the same size as ours. It will pass ours within the next decade, but not a wealthy country on a per capita basis relative to us. And how to get these countries to adopt emission-saving technologies, it strikes me as being a very high lift, very hard. And so I'm wondering, how do we address this issue? We can all talk about goals, but if we establish goals that are 40 years out, then the reality is these politicians that establish them recognize they'll be long gone, and someone else is going to have to deliver on them. So what can we do that actually has some prospect of reducing the emissions on our planet?
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Romney. Thank you as well for your leadership on this issue, for your membership in the Bipartisan Solutions Caucus, and I understand this deal is happening perhaps right now, for working so hard on this bipartisan infrastructure deal, which would have a significant, I think, implication on what we're discussing here today. You know, goals are terrific. When I was in the private sector working with very large organizations, we often found it very helpful to set aggressive goals. But as you said, those goals need to be in the moderately near term. They need to be very specific, and you need to have at least some idea that you have a toolkit in place that you can take action on to achieve those goals. I think right now the problem is that we're asking the rapidly developing countries of the world to change their trajectory and to do something very different than the way we developed our own economy, but we've not given them the tools in order to do that. So much of the rest of the world sits on literally, effectively infinite coal reserves. If you look at Indonesia, South Africa, India, China, right? As long as that remains the most economical technology to use, they're very likely to continue to use those reserves, and that's how we developed our economy. It's hard to blame them for that. We need to provide a better like-for-like substitute to very cheap, very reliable, high-performing, quick-to-build coal technologies, especially the subcritical coal technologies that are the older, less efficient things that are being built in so much of the world. The good news is we know many of the candidate technologies to do that. We know that that's probably some combination of continued use of fossil fuels, but with carbon capture that turns that CO2 into either a commodity or that safely stores it underground, or it's advanced nuclear energy that's also very power dense and could be sited on a small footprint of land, or it's enhanced geothermal, or it's some combination of other renewable resources, but combined with really long duration storage technologies. So we know it's some combination of those. It's probably a portfolio of those things. And the good news is, in the Energy Act of 2020 that you passed back in December, you established a moonshot program to demonstrate those technologies. We now here in the United States have very aggressive, statutorily mandated goals to demonstrate that whole suite of technologies, somewhere between 2023 and 2027, based on the technology. Y'all are in talks right now about potentially funding those demonstration programs. Once those are stood up and developed and demonstrated here in the United States, then we really need to focus on assembling realistic financing packages and technological expertise to get that into the developing world. Right now, China will offer those developing countries virtually anything they want to build. That's usually the cheapest technology. We've got to have a realistic alternative package. And we've got the development finance and export credit agencies to do that, but we could do a lot more with what we have, and we could do a lot more to beef up the resources of those agencies.
So China is adding to the problem by building new coal facilities around the world. People want coal plants. They'll build a new coal plant, and that'll be spewing CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the environment. No friend to the planet, despite what they say they're going to be doing themselves. It sounds to me like you feel that the answer for the world is technology, not necessarily some breakthrough, cold fusion or something that we can't even imagine, but instead saying, okay, how do we take known technologies, or some perhaps we don't even know yet? How do we take these, commercialize them in a way that's inexpensive, such that a country like Indonesia that has ample coal reserves would say, okay, I'll use this other technology because it's about the same cost. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. The good news, again, is that we have things that are near the finish line, but unfortunately that first breakthrough, that first pilot or small-scale demonstration is a long way from having something that's actually cost-effective enough to deploy it at global scale. Energy planners around the world, and I've worked with them in Southeast Asia, they're very conservative, just like they are here in the United States. They're responsible for electrifying their economies, for keeping the lights on as often as possible, for keeping hospitals and cold chains and all of these very, very important facilities up and running in their economies. They need to see something that they can believe in. They need to see something that they have a reasonably good chance is going to be built and developed really in a presidential cycle in many cases in their home country, so that they can also get the credit for having built the thing. And they need export credit. No large facilities are built anywhere in the developing world without the sovereign backing and guarantee of someone on the creditor and vendor side. And so if that's not going to be the China Belt and Road Initiative, that needs to be some combination of the United States and our allies and some combination of our collective export credit.
Let me ask you in that regard, with regards to carbon capture, Where are we in carbon capture? I understand that the Chinese are doing a major facility in carbon capture. Where is the technology here? Do we have companies that are actually making real progress there? What more should we be doing there? What kind of hope do you attribute to carbon capture technologies?
Just like China has taken the lead in solar photovoltaic cells, I think it's fair to say the United States has taken the lead in carbon capture technologies. We have one of the largest, best developed carbon capture industries here in the United States. We already capture and safely sequester or use for enhanced oil recovery literally millions of tons of carbon dioxide every year. We've got 5,000 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines. That sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot compared to the rest of our infrastructure for hydrocarbons in this country. The key now is further deployment to bring that down the cost. I'd say carbon capture is today perhaps where wind or solar were 10 years ago. So we now fully understand the technology. We understand how it works. We've piloted a lot of things, but we've got to deploy a lot of it to bring it down the learning curve so that it's actually ready to go for the really challenging conditions in the developing world.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Goodman, you've heard from Mr. Powell that at least from his perspective, that the answer to reduce global emissions really focuses on developing technologies and further applying technologies that would be adopted in the parts of the world that are growing fastest, that are adding massive amounts of CO2 to the environment: China, Indonesia, Brazil, India. Is that an approach that makes sense to you? Ms. Goodman, do you subscribe to Mr. Powell's perspective?
Well, I subscribe to the perspective that we can best lead in a race to the top by seeking our own American competitiveness with those technologies that Rich Powell mentioned. I think they're all very good. And I think also from a national security perspective, many of them are very useful to enhance and make more secure the defense mission. And where there's an alignment between the needs for the military mission and opportunities to lead by example in a broader commercial sphere, you get a double, you get a double benefit. So, for example, the Defense Department leases hundreds of, over 150,000 vehicles a year from GSA, and those can be electrified, and that can lead to greater electrification of the vehicle transport system in the U.S. We use microgrids and other renewable technologies at forward operating bases in remote places. Many of those are similar to small villages around the world that have the use for similar technologies that can operate off grid. And that's going to be extremely valuable. So I think there are many ways, from the small modular reactors to various types of advanced microgrids and energy storage technologies, to climate predictive analytics that are going to be useful to turn various sectors such as agriculture, transportation, and defense planning to have better analysis and climate predictive at the granular scale to plan future security risks and prevent them. That there are opportunities both to lead by example that enhance the defense mission and at the same time provide commercial and global competitiveness benefit.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question and then turn to the chairman who just got back. I'll give him a chance to look at his notes here. But that is, if I had $1 trillion to spend or $2 trillion to spend, if I were deciding all by myself how we as a nation would spend funds relating to climate change, and I won't say over what period, but I guess there's a question as to where would that money be most effective in reducing the emissions into the planet? Would it be that we, for instance, do a better job insulating old buildings and getting people to drive vehicles that are more fuel efficient here in the United States? Or would it be investing in new technologies, carbon capture, perhaps small-scale nuclear power plants, other sources of energy generation, cement manufacture technology, innovations, and so forth, that would be adopted here and around the world? And so I'm not telling you that you have to put all your money in only one bucket. You might say, well, I'd take 80% and put it in one and 20% in the other. But how do you see that priority in where we should be investing our resources? And I know my Democrat friends may be tempted to say, well, we'll just spend as much as we need in all the categories, but I know there is some limit as to how much you can spend. So assuming that, where should we devote the bulk of our resources if we're really interested in reducing the CO2 going into the environment and other greenhouse gases, and actually seeing the global temperature kept at a 1.5 degrees Celsius target? Yeah, I'll start with Mr. Powell. Thank you.
Unsurprisingly, Senator, I think I'd put the vast majority of the resources in the latter bucket, which would be to really effectively demonstrate a whole suite of these technologies. And as you mentioned, not just in the clean power sector, but also thinking really seriously about how do we rethink steel production and concrete production? How do we think about retrofitting all the fuel in the world and replacing it with clean hydrogen over time, as opposed to the existing traditional hydrocarbon fuel over time? So I think there's a significant pool of resources for that demonstration program. I think there's another significant pool of resources for smart incentives so that we deploy all of those things and sort of test them and demonstrate them in our markets while we rapidly bring down the cost. And then there's a third major pool of incentives around export credit and development finance investment in the rapidly developing world to scale those things up. The last thing I'll say is that you can magnify all of those investments if you reform the permitting structure within the United States so that the same pool of resources gets you further, because it doesn't have the same cost and time and permitting costs in actually developing and demonstrating all that here in the U.S.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. Ms. Goodman, do you want to answer the same question?
Well, I agree with much of what Rich said. I think that we have to be able to walk and chew gum. You know, we have to show leadership here at home in our own transition at the same time that we want to move markets overseas and show American competitiveness in these areas and help those. It may be a race to the top, but we have to help those who are at the bottom as well. And so I think that we can lead with technology demonstration, test, and deployment, and enabling our own private sector better commercially to compete and have a viable alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's going to be much to our strategic advantage, because our security in the region depends not only on military security, but now, as we see, commercial, energy, and environmental security. They, in fact, all go together. And we have to keep in mind also that there are many opportunities in nature-based solutions in all of these sectors that we're talking about that need technology advancement and rapid development as well.
Thank you. Now, having taken advantage of 3 rounds of questions for myself, I turn to the chairman.